Good Shabbos. Our parashah this week, of course, is entitled Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah. Now, a lot of people want to ask the question, why is this parashah entitled the life of Sarah, when the only real mention of Sarah is in the first two verses, and it says that Sarah was 127 years old when she died, and that was the life of Sarah. And it's the reason, it's not that the emphasis is on the death of Sarah. Notice it says the life of Sarah. What is Sarah's life? Sarah's life is the beginning of the matriarchs. It is the ones who begin the purpose of God to bring forth His plan. It is the matriarchs that give stability to the wildest of man, therefore ensuring that the plan of God continues in the way that it should. And we see this in the careful instructions given to Eliezer by Abraham to choose a wife for Isaac. And if we look in chapter 24 and begin at verse 1 and continue to verse 4, we'll see. Now Abraham was old, advanced in years, and Adonai blessed Abraham in everything. And then Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who managed everything that belonged to him, now put your hand under my thigh, so that I may make you take an oath by Adonai, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. On the contrary, to my land and to my relatives you must go and get a wife for my son Isaac. Now we notice that the women in the land of Canaan evidently were not equal to who Sarah was. He couldn't find an equal to Sarah among the Canaanite women. And the closest people he knew that he could find someone who was equal to her and her attributes and her personality would be from those that were his close relative. And so he entrusted his eldest servant, Eliezer, who at this time, if Abraham is 100 and I would say 30 years old at this time, 140, Eliezer has to be like 100. Okay? So he's trusting his most wisest servant to carefully find a wife. And because it's his oldest servant had been around Sarah enough to understand her qualities, so that when he met a woman with that quality, he knew that it would be the right choice for Isaac. And we find that in chapter 24, starting at verse 10, and it goes to verse 12, it goes to verse 20. And Eliezer is praying as he's arrived at around Naran, which is Nahor's city, which is where Abraham and Sarah were from. And he prays, Adonai, the God of Abraham, my master. He said, please make something happen before me today and show loyalty to Abraham, my master. Look, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are going out to draw water. Now, let it be that a young woman to whom I say, please, tip your jar so that I may drink, and she will say, drink, and I'll also water your camels. Let her be the one that you have appointed for your servant Isaac. So by this I know that you have shown graciousness to my master. Now before he had finished speaking, behold, there was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, going out with her jar on her shoulder. Now the young woman was very good looking, a girl of marriageable age, and she was a virgin. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. And then the servant ran to meet her and said, please, let me sip a little water from your jar. And so she said, drink, my lord. And she quickly lowered her jar into her hand, and she gave him a drink. And now when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I'll also draw water for your camels until they finished drinking. Can you think about it? What of this one interaction tells Eleazar that this is the bride for Isaac.
Given to the camel, or given to her, what were the camels, or what were they?
She will stop everything of her needs to give to others in need. And Sarah was known for her hospitality. He noticed her looks. He noticed that she was of marriageable age. He noticed that she was a virgin. And these were all clearly marked because of the way a young maiden would dress at the time. And more likely she didn't have a nose ring. Yes. That would have denoted she may have been married. Anyway. But the main thing is her personality and her heart. She wasn't selfish. Sarah wasn't selfish. And she would serve. Sarah served. And that was the way he knew that he had found the right one for Isaac to replace Sarah. Therefore, Sarah's life is not ended. But now the life of Sarah continues. But it's picked up in Rebekah's life. And this is what we find as we go through this parashah here. But then also we can look at the Haftarah portion in 1 Kings. If we turn to 1 Kings chapter 1, we will find that it's a similar situation. In our parashah, the life of Sarah, the importance is finding the next progenitor of the seed of Abraham, in order that God's promise will be fulfilled. Someone that is qualified to take that position. And in 1 Kings we find that the point is to find the successor to David, the one who will continue the Davidic quality of the kingship of Israel, one who has been ordained for that by God himself. And you notice the story begins with Adonijah, his second eldest son, concluding on his own accord that he should go and become king because his father's old. You notice how they describe him. He's old, and they have covered him in clothing. In other words, they put, and realize now, we're talking about living in the Middle East, where it's a very warm climate, and he cannot get warm, and so they have covered him in clothes. And then on top of that, they have given him a young, beautiful maiden to serve him and laid beside him, hoping to stoke up his inner coals and warm him up. That's the truth. And yet it says, but the king was never intimate with her. He was not of that way. But we find that Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, has been told about what's going on by Nathan the prophet, and she intercedes to make sure that the rightful son sits on the throne of her husband David. And then we find in verses 10 through 13. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the mighty man, or Solomon. But Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, saying, haven't you heard that Adonijah, son of Haggith, has assumed the kingship, and our Lord David doesn't know? Now come, please, let me give you advice. Save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go at once to King David and say to him, my lord the king, haven't you sworn to your handmaiden, saying, surely your son Solomon will become king after me, and he will sit on my throne. Then why does Adonijah reign? Behold, while you are still there talking with the king, I will come in after you to confirm your words. And you notice, Nathan knows what David has promised Bathsheba, because David has conferred this to him. And this is why Nathan is worried that no one is stopping Adonijah from trying to be coronated the next king of Israel. And And only David can stop it, but David is oblivious to what's going on. He has basically resigned himself to die. That's what he's done. But yet his work is not done. He has to name his successor. And so Nathan says, you need to remind the king of his need to name Solomon as his successor. Or otherwise, you will be in dire straits, you and your son, because Adonijah will eliminate anyone who can vie him for the throne. He's a man of war. Solomon was not. Solomon was known as a man of peace. His name means peace. And so we go on and further down in chapter 1 there to verse 24 through 30, and then we get the gist of everything that's going on. And then Nathan said, my lord the king, did you not say, Adonijah shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne? For he has gone down and slain oxen, fattened cattle, and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the king's sons, the captains of the army, and Abiathar the Cohen, and behold, they're eating and drinking with them, and they're saying, long live King Adonijah. But he did not invite me, your servant, or Zadok the Cohen, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, or your servant Solomon. Who was this thing? What was this thing done by my lord the king without letting your servants know who should sit on the throne of my lord the king after him? And then David answered and said, summon Bathsheba to me. So she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king swore an oath, as Adonai lives, who has redeemed my soul out of all distress, as surely as I swore to you by Adonai the God of Israel, saying that your son Solomon will be king after me, and will sit on my throne in my place. Thus I will surely fulfill it this day. David will not waste another second before he writes what is going wrong there. But it was only through the intervention of a matriarch, Bathsheba, that he even took the time to set this right. He was so engrossed in his own problems that he hadn't thought of the problems that would arise after his own passing. And then even when we look in Matthew's gospel in the genealogy of the greatest descendant of Sarah, Yeshua, it shows that without women, man would be incomplete emotionally, spiritually, and even physically. And that is why the Torah emphasizes the lives of women as well as men. Sarah was more than the mother of Isaac and the mother of all the faithful in God. She is the example of how God changes the natural into the godly. She becomes a woman who considers only her outward things and becomes a woman who fulfills the plan of God, giving birth to Isaac at 99 years of old. Sarah was not a mousy woman neither. She was an intelligent, confident woman who understood exactly who she was in God's order of creation. And therefore, she was the one who brought forth the son of promise from her body at 99 years old. Not Abraham. She delivered Isaac. It was her that nursed and raised up Isaac to the age when his father could begin teaching him how to be a godly man. It was her early instruction and her example as a mother and wife that enabled Eliezer, Abraham's servant, to find Isaac's perfect wife, Rebekah, one that he did not need a long courtship for because of how she filled Sarah's place so fitly. Who could forget Sarah's demand for Hagar and Ishmael's departure from the camp in order to protect her son and the plan of God for him in order to fulfill it? We should remember that it was God who told Abraham to listen to his wife Sarah as she had given him good, godly counsel. This same courageous attitude is found in Isaac's wife when he becomes spiritually blind in his old age to the plan of God and attempts to pass the baton of Israel from Jacob to Esau by giving the blessing of the firstborn. Jacob is God's choice, not Esau. Rebekah is the one who steps in and ensures that Isaac fulfills what is right before God. This is the picture portrayed of Bathsheba when David is soon to die, and the continuation of his reign as the king should be with Solomon. Yet, Adonijah, his second-born, is already beginning his ordination process without the consent of his father David. God steps in, allowing Nathan to remind Bathsheba what was happening and what could happen to her and to Solomon, and knows that the Lord had revealed to David that Solomon would be king after him, as this was God's choice, and that David had declared all this to Bathsheba as a form of comfort to her after the loss of their firstborn son. That was the consequence of the sin that they had shared in. But like Sarah before her, demanding for her son of the Hagar to be removed and the true son of promise secured in his place, Bathsheba presents her case to David, who orders it that it come to pass, even though when we look into the Gospel of Matthew's genealogy, we may not find Miriam being portrayed as such, as Yeshua's mother. But the first 17 verses contain the names of other women of merit, other matriarchs who brought forth the plan of God. It declares in the book of genealogy of Yeshua the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew ties Yeshua to the patriarchs, and in this way he ties him to the matriarchs. There's no way that you can get from one without the other. But still, this genealogy does contain other notable women whose presence was necessary to the appearance of the Messiah. Even when we find Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, who was denied her privilege of the Levirate marriage because of Judah's fear that his youngest son would also perish if he married her. That she has used deception of Judah in order to become pregnant and raise up a son to her husband's name. She gives birth to twins, Perez and Zerah, of which Perez becomes the progenitor of Yeshua. That leads us to Rahab, who marries Salmon, one of the spies sent to Jericho, who were protected by Rahab the prostitute. Rahab, the Canaanite, who gives birth to Boaz, of the fame of the book of Ruth, who marries Ruth, the converted Moabitess, and brings forth a son, Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, the king of Israel. Then the record presents David's son, Solomon, whose mother was Uriah's wife. We all know that means Bathsheba, but it was being courteous and to remind them of where Solomon's roots were. And then finally, there's a play on lineage when we come to when Matthew records that it was Jacob who fathers Joseph, the husband of Miriam, from whom was born Yeshua, who is called Messiah, in verse 16. Jacob, whose favorite son was Joseph, who was a type of Messiah to his people. There was the Jacob, the son of Beth, who fathers Joseph, who gives us Yeshua, the real Messiah. But what is the common denominator in these women? What is it that makes them all stand out amongst women? A boldness, a courage to stand for what is right, to stand for the Word of God. Every one of these women, first and foremost, believed in the truth of the one God of Abraham, from Tamar to Ruth. Who can forget Ruth's declaration to Naomi before leaving Moab? Your people will become my people, and your God will be my God. Every one of these women were willing to take the initiative in their circumstances. Tamar brought about the child that was owed to her by Judah's sons. Rahab covenanted with the Israelite spies in Jericho for the safety and protection of her family and the destruction of Jericho. And Ruth took it upon herself to glean the fields in order to provide for herself and Naomi, and through her work and trustworthiness she found her kinsman redeemer that rescued her and Naomi from a life of poverty, Boaz. These women were examples of godliness in action. You might ask me, how can this be, as most of these last three were not worshipers of God in the beginning? And I would answer you that even in their unbelief, God himself was turning their hearts towards him, as can be seen through their actions and the way their lives were finished and not begun. Godliness is prevalent in each one of them. It isn't missing. But isn't the real point in that God takes those who are in need of him and changes them into examples of his grace and mercy through the circumstances of their lives, whether they're a man or a woman. Just as both man and woman equally share the image of God, though fallen, God offers his salvation to both men and women equally through Yeshua the Messiah. How many of us wouldn't be in a synagogue now if we weren't for the example of the good, godly Jewish mother or grandmother who insisted that we needed God to grow up successfully and wouldn't let us slide by, but bore us through love and personal example? And even if this was not the way that we became the faithful to Adonai through Yeshua, should we no less recognize and bless those women in our lives for the lives of Sarah that they had lived before us? This is why, as Jews, we proclaim the blessing on Shabbat over our daughters, that you may be like Sarah and Rebekah and Leah and Rachel, truthful examples of godliness that comes from simple faith in Adonai. And gentlemen, we should also purpose not to just bless our wives and mothers as a Ashit Hayel, a woman of valor, but we should also purpose for ourselves to be a blessing to them, giving of ourselves, our respect, our time, our resources, and fulfilling our image of Messiah to them. The husband who will willingly lay down his life in order to present his bride as spotless before the Lord. Even Messiah honored his mother before he left this earth by placing her trust in another man's faithful care, fulfilling his responsibility as a Jewish man before the Lord. That is the necessity of our matriarchs. That is the need for women. People wonder, are they demeaned? Are they unequaled? Or valueless in God's economy? But if it wasn't for Sarah, if it wasn't for Rebekah, if it wasn't for Leah and Rachel, or if it wasn't even for Eve, there would be no Messiah. There would be no salvation. That's the truth of God's Word. That's why we are equal in His eyes. That's why we are equally responsible before Him to love each other accordingly and respect each other accordingly. In every one of these circumstances of the patriarchs, their husbands never disrespected their wives. In fact, their wives got them out of hot water more than once. And that was the blessing of having a matriarch. And so, I bid you to honor those in your lives who lived the life of Sarah. For she lives on in every woman who is bold, courageous, and stands firm in their faith, who is willing to live as God has called them to live. And that is the message of Chayei Sarah. Shabbat Shalom.